Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. The media is out there to consume your attention, and for some of you, that also means making you very afraid of the world we live in, the world you live in. And it is not a very healthy thing. I have known of many people in my own circles, close to me, who are scared of the world. And they're not scared of the world through a direct experience, that's one thing. They're scared of the world because of what is streamed to them on their televisions, their smartphones, and very rarely those who read the newspapers. And it is not a very healthy thing, because we live in a world where we are so connected. As humans, we have broken well past Dunbar's numbers, both in terms of connections, in terms of people we can know about, in terms of things we can know about. If I go back 400 to 500 years, hell, if I even go back just 100 years or 200 years, there is a very high probability that if something happened in the world, I would not hear about it for years, because word did not spread. And by the time I got news about something, there may not be an emotional response attached to it. Why? Because it happened so long ago. But now we have the opposite problem. We can hear about all the problems occurring in the world, and there are awful things that happen in our world. There have been many awful things happening very recently in all parts of the world. And I'm not just talking about in the Middle East or in Africa or in Asia. I'm talking close to home. And for some of you, for those of you who live in places like the UK, Australia, America, Canada, there are things, awful things that happen in the Western world. And the real thing is, do we need to react to everything? And my argument is, it does not make you a bad person if you decide to shut off and you decide to taper down the amount of media you are consuming. In fact, I have done that. I did that early last year, where I actually started reducing the amount of world news that was coming to things like my Twitter feed. I stopped reading the newspapers, except very rarely. And it was because I realized that all of this kind of rage bait, this kind of anger and hatred porn, it is really just exists to occupy my attention. And whilst I'm busy being angry about shit that doesn't even apply to me, that is happening somewhere else in the world, there are problems that are happening today in my life and around me and in the society that I actually live in that I'm not dealing with. And I almost think it's part of our system to make sure that the population is as distracted with problems that are not relevant to you as possible, so that things that do matter to you go unnoticed because you're reacting to something that's happening on the other side of the world. And you have to realize that it is not everyone's job to care about everything. And I know that some people think that this is going to sound very uncompassionate, but I still think you can be an incredibly compassionate person and not be tuned into every atrocity that is happening around our world. It is simply not sustainable for you to care about everything. And I've heard, for example, if we look at the Israel-Palestine argument, people will say, why do you care about this? Because you don't care about anything else. You don't care about this conflict that's happening in Africa or whatever. And I'm like, it doesn't work like that. I think it's perfectly rational for people to be selective about what they care about. And here's the thing. If you are in the category of people who are very invested in Israel and Palestine, chances are it is because you have a cultural, a historical, or an experiential connection to that conflict. You've either been in that part of the world, you're from that part of the world, you're either Jewish or you're Muslim, and naturally, that is going to mean you have strong feelings about that particular conflict. But for those of us who aren't from those demographics, whilst we can look inside and comment on these things and say, wow, that's really awful, everything that's happening over there, right? It doesn't have that same level of energy. And the question for the people who are really into those issues that you should ask yourself is, if I was not from this cultural background, would I have that same feeling about that issue? Because I know that when I put issues out there and ask for attention for them, which I have done, for example, I'm a Sri Lankan, and when there was an economic crisis and when people were protesting in the streets and they were cutting internet, I actually made a LinkedIn post. I made 2 LinkedIn posts asking people to call their relatives back home and tell them to get onto a public DNS so they can bypass the government's internet blocks. Because I'm like, if people are protesting, they should have access to the internet. But here's the thing, that's an issue for me. And if I wasn't Sri Lankan, if I didn't have that ethnic connection, that I'm from this place, would I have cared about that issue with the same vigor? And the answer is probably not. So I don't think we owe it to the world and to the media that just because they are presenting something to us, that we have to care about it. Now, that does not mean I'm not compassionate to the horrible things happening, but this is a question of capacity. Do I have the capacity to be glued into the media like a sheep and consuming all the negativity, all the hatred, all the ill will in the world? That is not going to do anyone good, any good. Because it is one of these things where if all I'm doing is becoming a negative person, then if anything, I'm making the world a worse place. And yes, horrible things do happen in the world. And do you know what the most important thing we can do as individuals is? It is to develop those good qualities within ourselves. It is to improve the communities immediately around us. If you have conflict in your own family unit, you are better off investing your energy into dealing with this than you are with the conflicts around the world. That is going to make a bigger impact on world peace. If you can resolve the hatred that lies in your own mind and the resentment that lies in your own heart towards people who are in your day-to-day, that will have a greater effect on world peace than you watching the newspapers and screaming and getting angry and getting heated. If the whole world would simply focus on themselves as an individual, because at the end of the day, we are the only entity we have true control over. There is nothing else in my life that I can control, and even to a certain degree, my own body, I do not control because it will fail me and eventually I will come to pass. I will lose my mental faculties, I will lose my physical faculties. But for a certain period of time, the entity that I have the greatest control over is myself. And so I owe it to develop me, to develop myself. And from myself, I can influence change immediately around me. And if the whole world simply focused on this, I truly believe we could resolve so many problems. But for the time being, just because the media exists, just because news companies exist, they live by the philosophy of if it bleeds, it leads. And their goal is to capture your attention. Their goal is to make you angry. A lot of these wars that are happening in the world right now, they are not wars simply between people. There are bigger powers at play. There are warmongers. There are politicians. There are arms companies who want you to get triggered, who want you to be reactive, who want you to think that you need to get involved in a conflict that has absolutely nothing to do with you. And so don't allow them to get you. Reduce your consumption of media because it is not healthy. And do not live in fear of the world. Because whilst there are all these negative things that happen in the world, if I've learned anything in the past few months of traveling, it is that there is so much beauty in this world. And you can choose what you want to see. And the reality is, all the beauty that I see day to day, it is not in the newspaper. It is not what people are focusing on. It is not something that is going to attract 100 million likes. But there is beauty in the world. And you are far better off, not just for yourself, but for the entire world, you are far better off focusing on that beauty. And so with that, I will leave this episode there. And please do not be frightened of the world. So to those of you listening to this, I wish you great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.